a Navy warship suddenly comes to a halt in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The youngest and most elite engineering teams are sent in, but no one can figure out why, until a black woman in her 60s walks in carrying an old metal toolbox. The engineers smirk, whisper, then mock her. She doesn't look like someone who belongs here. What they don't know is that she's the one who built the very heart of the machine they're trying to fix, and she's the only one who still knows how to make it breathe again. Before we go back, let us know where you're watching from, and subscribe because tomorrow I've got something extra special for you. The USS Washington sliced through the vast Pacific with the confidence of a steel titan. Its engines hummed with steady precision, propelling the destroyer forward beneath a blue-gray sky. The surface of the ocean was calm, unbothered by the vessel's passage. Every system on board operated like clockwork. Sailors moved with practiced efficiency, radar stations scanned the horizon, and officers studied maps and mission briefs under dim tactical lighting. This was no routine patrol. The Washington was carrying classified equipment and escorting an intelligence vessel to a restricted zone just beyond contested waters. Every second counted. Every piece of machinery on board had to perform with absolute reliability. Then, without warning, the hum stopped. At first, it was subtle, barely noticed. The vibrations in the floor vanished. A few sailors looked up uncertain. Lights flickered for half a second. Stabilizers shifted uncomfortably. The engines had gone silent. In the command deck, Captain Elias Monroe straightened in his chair. He was a seasoned man, broad-shouldered with a face carved by sea wind and years of command. His eyes darted to the readouts. The propulsion display blinked a single red word, offline. He stood up, voice sharp. Bridge status on engine power. The response was immediate. Sir, we've lost all propulsion. Auxiliary systems are holding. No heat spikes, no explosions. It just stopped. Monroe didn't wait. Engineering. Now. He moved quickly through the metal corridors, boots thudding against steel, every step growing heavier as the ship's silence deepened. No engine noise, no tremble through the hull. A ship like the Washington should never be this quiet. He arrived at the engine control center, a brightly lit room packed with panels, readouts, and blinking diagnostic screens. Chief Engineer Powell was already there, sleeves rolled up, eyes locked on a frozen schematic of the LM 2500 gas turbine. "Talk to me, Chief." Powell looked up, frustration and confusion drawn across his face. "Sir, we're not getting any ignition sequence from the turbines. The power flow's good. Cooling systems are nominal. The command systems aren't kicking in. Manual override failed 3 times. We bypassed the ignition module. No change." Monroe folded his arms, jaw tight. "Did something overload?" "Nope. And there's no warning logs either. It's like the engine just decided to stop." The captain stared at the screen. "This mission can't wait. We have a timeline, a window. I want every engineer you've got in this room, now." Within 20 minutes, some of the Navy's top propulsion specialists were flown in by helicopter. 2 were from a private contractor based out of California, the same company that helped install the Washington's propulsion core. The others came straight from Pearl Harbor's engineering detachment, highly credentialed, highly paid, completely baffled. They ran diagnostics, disassembled the control interface, replaced sensors, rebooted systems. Hours passed. Nothing changed. A young lieutenant stepped into the engine room around midnight holding a tablet. "Captain," he said, hesitating, "we just ran the full diagnostic tree from command. Every branch. There are no mechanical faults. Nothing in software either. Every reading says this engine should be running." Monroe's voice dropped. "And yet it's not." "No, sir." A tall civilian in a crisp button-up shirt crossed his arms and shook his head. "We've run 3 sets of thermal scans. No overheating, no pressure inconsistencies. This isn't a sensor issue." Another voice, younger, more impatient, piped up. "It has to be software. No way it's mechanical. We've replaced everything short of the turbine casing." Bailey turned around sharply, his voice clipped, then explained why 5 full engineering teams couldn't find it. The room fell into uneasy silence, save for the distant hum of equipment from nearby maintenance bays. A few officers exchanged glances. Most of them had never seen the ship this quiet for this long. The USS Washington wasn't just any destroyer, it was one of the Navy's most strategically advanced vessels, and it was scheduled to deploy in less than 72 hours. Admiral Jonathan Mears entered without ceremony, his dark uniform sharply pressed face lined with fatigue. His silver hair was neatly parted, but his eyes gave away the stress of the last 48 hours. Everyone straightened instinctively. He didn't speak right away. He stepped past the console, looked at the blackened screen, then turned to the group. "So, what I'm hearing is, we're blind. This ship's heart just stopped and no one knows why." Bailey cleared his throat. "Sir, with respect, we've gone through every checklist, every manual. The core sinks for 45 seconds, then crashes. No alerts, no recorded imbalance. It's like the engine shuts itself off before something worse happens." The Admiral's lips tightened. "And you're telling me that between the Navy's best engineers and the private sector's finest diagnostics, no one can give me an answer?" Monroe exhaled through his nose, frustration boiling under his calm exterior. "What am I supposed to tell command? That our billion-dollar destroyer is floating dead in the water, and no one knows why?" Again silence. Then something shifted in his expression, a brief flicker in his eyes. A name. He said it without thinking, like it had been hiding in the back of his mind all this time. Harris. The word hung in the air. One of the civilian engineers blinked. "Sir," the captain didn't answer right away. His gaze locked onto the motionless turbine, like it had suddenly begun speaking a language he hadn't heard in years. He finally spoke low and steady. "Leona Harris." Powell raised his brow. The Leona Harris Monroe nodded. "She used to run engineering on the Roosevelt back in the day. She was on the design team for the original LM 2500S, had a reputation for diagnosing engine issues by sound alone. I thought she was retired. She is. Has been for, 17 years?" He paused. "After Guam." The rain fell softly on the rusted tin roof of the old workshop, tapping a rhythm that Leona Harris had grown used to over the years. The building sat at the edge of a winding back road in southern Louisiana, about 20 miles from any proper town. Cypress trees lined the gravel driveway. The place had no sign, no front desk, and no fancy diagnostic equipment. Just oil-stained concrete shelves of mismatched parts and a small wood stove tucked in the corner. Leona stood by her workbench holding the carburetor from a two-stroke boat engine. Her dark hands, scarred and strong, moved with the kind of care that only came from thousands of hours of muscle memory. She examined the piece, then wiped it with a clean cloth, turning it slowly under the flickering workshop light. She wore a faded denim shirt, sleeves rolled to her elbows, and a pair of grease-marked coveralls. Her close-cropped silver hair peeked from under a ball cap that had long lost its shape. Her face was hard, angular, jaw-deep eyes, and the kind of frown that made people think twice before asking questions. But today she wasn't angry, just quiet. A small transistor radio crackled from a shelf nearby, playing blues low and steady. It was the same station she listened to every morning, the same one her father had kept on when he ran this place. Leona had been born in this workshop, figuratively at least. Her earliest memories were of lying on a pile of burlap rags while her father explained the difference between a gasket and a washer. She'd spent her 12th birthday disassembling the washing machine after it broke. She'd put it back together the next day without missing a single screw. By 13, she was fixing lawnmowers for neighbors. By 16, she knew more about engine compression ratios than most men twice her age. Not because she was a genius, but because she had to be. Her father, Leonard Harris, was a quiet man who believed in work, not praise. He was also a black mechanic running a business in a time and place where customers often assumed he wasn't the owner. He taught Leona everything he knew, but he also warned her about what came next. "They'll always be looking for a reason to doubt you," he said, once handing her a torque wrench, "especially when you're smarter than they are. And you will be." He was right. Leona joined the Navy at 19. Not because she dreamed of the sea, but because she wanted access to machines she couldn't touch in any garage. She started as an E1, spent her nights buried in tech manuals, memorizing turbine systems like they were scripture. She rose quickly, not because anyone gave her a hand, but because she earned every stripe through grit and sweat. By her late 30s, she had become chief machinery officer on the USS Franklin, then the Roosevelt. Her reputation spread quietly across the fleet. Leona Harris was the woman who could hear when an engine was lying. While others trusted sensors, she trusted rhythm pulse and noise, and she was rarely, almost never wrong. But even legends aren't safe when the system decides they're inconvenient. 17 years ago, during a routine training exercise off the coast of Guam, a turbine failed mid-operation. No lives were lost, no injuries reported, but the incident shut down the ship for 2 days. An investigation was launched. Leona submitted her reports, sat through interviews, explained the failure patterns, flagged an untested software patch as the likely cause. But her voice never made it to the final hearing. She was told quietly and without ceremony that she had failed to perform proper maintenance on the unit. The decision came in a standard envelope. No trial, no panel, just a letter terminating her commission and forcing her into early retirement. No one from her command stood up for her. No one visited her quarters that night. Her locker was cleared within 24 hours. The halls that once buzzed with respect turned quiet when she passed. Her replacement, a man half her experience, refused to look her in the eye. She had given nearly 20 years to the Navy, and in one moment, all of it was wiped clean by a system that didn't want to look inward, that needed a name to put on the file and a body to push out the door, because Leona was a black woman with more knowledge than most of her commanding officers, because she didn't smile when she didn't mean it, because she didn't play politics, because she expected to be judged by her work, not her skin, not her voice, not her gender. She hadn't stepped onto a Navy vessel since. Instead, she returned to this old workshop, back to the place where her hands had first learned to listen. Locals brought their boats by, mostly older folks, shrimpers, and crabbers. They knew her by reputation. They didn't ask about Guam. They didn't care that she once commanded an engineering team on a nuclear-class destroyer. They just knew that if Leona couldn't fix it, no one could. She never talked about what happened. Not to her neighbors, not to the young boys she occasionally let hang around the shop to learn. She didn't need to. The silence spoke for itself. Every time she walked past the framed Navy certificate still hanging crooked on the back wall, she would glance at it once, then look away. She didn't hang it there out of pride. She hung it there so she wouldn't forget. Not the years of service, but the way it ended. There were days she still ran over that hearing in her head, wondering what she could have said, what she should have done differently. But the truth was, she never stood a chance. The decision had already been made. She was just the final formality. Leona had known from the start that she would have to work harder than the men around her, that every mistake would cost her more. What she didn't know was how quiet the betrayal would be. Not a scream, not a confrontation, just the absence of voices when she needed them most. Because that's how injustice often works. It doesn't come crashing in with sirens. It seeps in through the silence. And now, years later, that silence was broken only by the sound of an old engine turning on her bench and the occasional hum of her radio in the corner. She didn't expect anyone from the Navy to ever call again. She had moved on. At least she told herself she had. But something about the way she paused every time she heard military aircraft flying overhead suggested otherwise. Something about the way she always kept her tools perfectly aligned in the old Navy-issue crate said she hadn't quite let go. She just learned to live with it, because women like Leona Harris didn't have the luxury of rage. They only had the choice to keep working or be erased. And as the afternoon light slipped through the cracks in the walls, casting long shadows over engine parts and grease-streaked rags, Leona wiped her hands and reached for her coffee, not knowing that somewhere out in the Pacific, a billion-dollar ship had just shut down and her name had just been spoken for the first time in 17 years. Not out of blame, but out of hope. The sun had already slipped behind the trees when the old rotary phone in Leona's workshop rang. She was bent over the lower hull of a battered outboard engine, tightening a valve cap with her left hand while holding a shop rag under the drip line with her right. The sound of the ring was sharp, jarring out of place in the quiet evening hum of cicadas and river wind brushing against the aluminum siding. She froze for a moment, eyes narrowing. That phone almost never rang. Not anymore. Leona set the wrench down gently and wiped her hands on the rag, leaving streaks of oil on her palms. Her boots echoed on the concrete floor as she walked across the shop. The ringing continued steady. She lifted the receiver from the hook and pressed it to her ear. "Leona Harris," she said, simply, voice low, cautious. There was a pause. Then a voice came through, calm but familiar, deeper than she remembered, but unmistakable. "Leona, it's Ryan Matthews." Her jaw tightened. She said nothing. The voice continued, a little more tentative now. "Admiral Ryan Matthews, I don't know if you remember me." Leona's fingers gripped the base of the receiver, her thumb running along the chipped edge of the handle. She didn't respond. "I served under you on the Roosevelt," he added, "back when I was still green. You once made me stay in the engine room overnight until I could name every part of the feed system without notes. I remember," she said, finally, her tone clipped. "You thought the intercooler was a filter housing." He let out a short, awkward laugh. "Yeah, I did." Silence again. The only sound in the room was the hum of the ceiling fan, its metal blades ticking faintly as they rotated. "Leona," he said more carefully now, "I'm calling because we have a problem. A serious one." She leaned against the workbench, saying nothing. He took that as a signal to continue. "The USS Washington has suffered a total propulsion failure. We're dead in the water. We've brought in every engineering team we have, public and private. No one's been able to find the cause. It's not showing up on sensors. And time is running out." Leona closed her eyes, exhaled slowly through her nose. "I know what they did to you," Ryan continued. "What happened after Guam? That wasn't justice. I know that now." Her voice was steady, but flat. "Took you long enough." He didn't argue. "You're the only person who ever understood the LM 2500 from the inside out," he said. "You knew it before the contractors did, before the specs were even finalized. You didn't just read the schematics, you could hear what the machine needed. You felt it." Leona opened her eyes and looked around the shop. The pegboard wall with tools hung in careful order, the yellow light spilling from the single overhead bulb, the photo of her father on the shelf above the breaker box. All of it had kept her sane, but none of it had erased what was taken. She spoke slowly, her words measured. 17 years ago, I gave everything I had to a system that tossed me out without a second thought. I lost my commission, my name, my reputation, and nobody stood up. I know. No hearing, no appeal, just a signature at the bottom of a file someone else wrote. There was a pause on the line. "I can't change what happened," Ryan said, "but I can tell you this right now. There's a ship out there that needs you. The people on board don't care what politics were at play 17 years ago. They care if they get home. And if you still care about that ship, about the work you did, then I'm asking you to help." Leona's heart beat slow, steady but heavy. She could feel it in her chest like a dull drum. Her fingers curled slightly around the cord. In her mind, she could already see the looks. The same stares she got that last week on base. The averted eyes. The barely concealed smugness from men who thought they'd finally cleared the path of a difficult woman. A black woman, one who didn't smile, didn't flirt, didn't flatter, one who simply worked better than anyone else. She'd buried that anger for years. But now, standing in the middle of the workshop that had become her entire world, she felt it rise again, not as rage, but as clarity. She didn't owe them anything, but she owed herself the truth. That engine, her engine, wasn't just a machine. It was the culmination of decades of her life. And now it was silent. And they were calling her not because they wanted to, but because they had no other choice. That meant something. "You think they'll even let me in the gate?" she asked. "I'll make sure they do," Ryan said. "Your clearance is already being reactivated, and I'll send a car tonight. You'll be in San Diego by morning." She said nothing. He added more softly, "I wouldn't call if this wasn't real. You're the last one who knows how to bring that ship back." There was another long silence. Then Leona nodded once, almost to herself. "Fine." Her voice was firm now. Not loud, not angry, just final. "Send the damn car." She hung up the phone. For a few seconds, she didn't move, just stood there, hand still resting on the receiver. Then she walked back to the bench, finished tightening the valve, wiped her hands, and put her tools away. She didn't pack much, just her old toolbox, the same one from her Navy days. The metal handle was worn smooth where her fingers had gripped it through thousands of hours. She opened it, checked the contents, then closed it again with a soft click. Outside, the night air had grown cooler. A distant bullfrog called from somewhere near the riverbank. Leona locked the shop door behind her and turned off the lights. Inside her chest, 100 memories stirred, some painful, some proud. But above all, one truth remained clear. She wasn't going back for them. She was going back for the machine, for the sailors, and for herself. Because some things you don't walk away from. Not when your name was once written into every turn of the engine. Not when it's still whispering your name in the silence. The sky over Norfolk Naval Base was overcast when the black sedan pulled up to the main security gate. The air was heavy with mist, the kind that clung to your skin without falling. As the car rolled to a stop, the guard on duty stepped out of the booth with slow indifference, clipboard in hand, adjusting his cap against the wind. The back door opened. Leona Harris stepped out, holding nothing but her metal toolbox in one hand and a folded clearance document in the other. Her dark skin contrasted against the pale gray of her worn jumpsuit. The knees were faded, the elbows stained from decades of honest labor. Her boots were clean, but not polished. Just enough to show she respected where she was, but not enough to impress anyone. The guard glanced up. He couldn't have been more than 22. His eyes flicked over her face, then down to the scuffed toolbox. "You here for someone, ma'am?" he asked, not unkindly, just confused. Leona handed him the document. Leona Harris. Engineering clearance. Admiral Matthews should have called ahead. The guard frowned and took the paper. He stepped back into the booth, tapped something into the terminal. Another guard, shorter, leaned over and looked at the screen. They exchanged a glance. The younger one raised an eyebrow. "You're with engineering, I am." He looked her over again. This time, the skepticism was less subtle. "Huh," he muttered before chuckling and shaking his head. "Didn't think they still sent folks like you out." Leona didn't respond. She just stood there, breathing through her nose, shoulders relaxed. Not a word. The shorter guard stepped outside, squinting at her. "You here to fix a heater or something?" His voice carried more bite, a casual edge meant to get a rise. Leona held his gaze for a moment, then looked past him. She wasn't here to entertain. The terminal beeped. The taller guard stepped back out with a forced grin. "Okay, you're cleared. Head down Main, then take a left past the supply depot. The hangar's about half a mile down." She nodded once, no thank you, no smile, and started walking. Behind her, the shorter one muttered not quite under his breath, "She doesn't even look like an engineer." Leona heard it. Of course she did. She always heard it. The walk to the hangar was long and exposed. Trucks passed on the road beside her. Sailors moved in and out of buildings. Some glanced her way. A few stared outright. One officer gave a slow look from her boots to her hair and then kept walking. It was the same look she remembered from years ago. A look that said, "You don't belong here." The hangar came into view, tall gray and humming with activity. Massive bay doors stood open, revealing the interior full of motion. Forklifts moved crates. Technicians shouted over engine noise. Inside was a world she hadn't stepped into in nearly 2 decades. She reached the entrance and was met by a lieutenant with a clipboard. He was slim, glasses perched on his nose, hair neatly trimmed. He stopped writing when he saw her. "Ma'am, I think you might be in the wrong Leona Harris," she said. He blinked. "Oh." His eyes dropped to the toolbox in her hand, then back to her face. He hesitated, then clearly struggling for something appropriate to say. He stepped aside. Right this way." She walked in the concrete floor, echoing under her boots. The air smelled of metal and hot lubricant, familiar and unchanged. Technicians bustled past her, some slowing just enough to glance, then glance again. Whispers followed. "Who's that? Was she cleared? She's not in uniform." A young woman near a diagnostic station leaned toward her coworker. "She looks like someone's grandma." Leona kept walking. Every step was a return to old terrain, only now she moved through it as a stranger. Every wall, every echo reminded her of what had been taken, and yet she felt no shame, no fear, only focus. They didn't need to believe in her. They just needed to stay out of her way. An engineer in his early 30s stepped into her path, arms crossed. He had a shaved head, clean uniform, and a clipboard held tightly under one arm. "You the consultant I am." He eyed the toolbox in her hand, then her clothes, then her face. "You're late," he said flatly. "I wasn't told there was a schedule," she replied, voice calm. "We've been over this engine for 2 straight days. Whatever you think you're going to do with that," he nodded at the box, "you might want to lower your expectations." Leona didn't answer. She didn't need to. The man stepped aside reluctantly. She moved forward and entered the central bay, where the LM-2500 gas turbine sat stripped open, exposed like a heart mid-surgery. Lights hung from the rafters. Engineers stood at nearby stations, eyes flicking toward her, then away. Someone snorted softly. Another whispered seriously. They called her. Leona heard them all. But she didn't stop, didn't slow down. She approached the engine and set the toolbox gently on the ground beside it. Then she stood for a moment just looking. In that instant, she wasn't 58 or retired or disgraced. She was the woman who knew this engine like she knew the lines on her own palms. And even if no one else in that room remembered that, she did. Behind her, the same lieutenant who had met her at the door turned to another officer and whispered, "I don't get it." "Why her?" The officer shrugged. "Hell if I know. Maybe she's just here for show." They laughed, soft and dismissive. Leona bent down, opened her toolbox, and pulled out a long, worn brass rod, a tool older than most of the men in that room. She held it lightly in her hand, the way a surgeon might hold a scalpel, and ran her thumb over the smooth edge. She didn't look at anyone, didn't explain what she was doing. She was here to work, and the machine was waiting. Let them whisper. Time would speak louder. The LM 2500 gas turbine sat at the center of the maintenance bay like a silent monument. Its casing had been stripped down, revealing the intricate guts of high-performance machinery, axial compressors, thermal insulation layers, turbine blades exposed and still. It should have been humming with life. Instead, it looked like a heart that had forgotten how to beat. Bright halogen lights lit every inch of the open structure. Diagnostic cables snaked across the floor, monitors flickered with data streams, and tool carts lined the walls in perfect order. Everything about the space was clean, orderly, clinical, but there was no movement, no sound, just tension. Leona stood at the edge of the platform, eyes fixed on the turbine. Her expression didn't change. Not at the sight of the tangled wiring, not at the tech manuals scattered across the metal table nearby. Not even at the long list of failed test reports taped to the side of the diagnostic terminal. 57 pages long. A tall man with a lanyard around his neck stepped forward. His uniform was crisp badge polished. He cleared his throat, speaking with the casual tone of someone who thought he was in control. "We've run complete systems checks, everything from fuel mix to ignition sequencing. We replaced the bypass valve, the thermal converter swapped the entire monitoring array twice. Still shuts down at 45 seconds. Then triggers a full safety lock." Leona didn't respond. The man frowned. "We're thinking it could be resonance failure in the secondary exhaust. Maybe microfractures throwing the readings off." She kept looking at the turbine. Steady. Silent. Another voice spoke from the other side of the platform. It was younger smug. "We've also ruled out sensor lag. Everything's calibrated to spec. Unless she's got something none of us thought of, we're out of options." That made a few others shift uncomfortably. One technician coughed into his sleeve. Another adjusted his glasses, pretending not to listen. Leona finally spoke. "Clear the room." The words landed like a dropped wrench. The man with the lanyard blinked. "I'm sorry, I want everyone quiet. No talking, no phones, no chatter. Just the machine." One of the younger engineers chuckled. "You want silence. This isn't a church, lady." Leona turned to him, her gaze steady and unimpressed. She didn't raise her voice. "This engine talks. You just never learned how to listen." The room held still. The lead engineer Powell, the one who had met her earlier, nodded. "Do it." A few grumbles rose up, but one by one, voices faded. Technicians powered down monitors. Phones were silenced. Even the background hum of the radio was switched off. The clamor of the room faded until all that remained was the soft clicking of cooling metal and the occasional creak of a shifting beam. Leona stepped closer to the turbine and set her toolbox down on the platform floor. She opened it with both hands and pulled out the long, polished brass rod. It was old, clearly handmade, both ends smooth from decades of use. She ran a finger down its length, checking for fractures. Then she crouched slowly and placed one end of the rod against the turbine housing, just behind the compressor mount. She pressed the other end to her ear and closed her eyes. No one moved. A technician shifted his weight and was immediately silenced by a look from Powell. The bay was still. Leona held the rod steady with both hands. Her breathing slowed. In her mind, she was already back in the lower decks of the Roosevelt, back in the crawl space of a humming mainline, listening not just for failure, but for character, for personality. Every engine had one. This one was trying to say something. It just hadn't been heard. After a long moment, she opened her eyes and stood. "Power it." A murmur rippled through the bay. The younger engineer from earlier scoffed. "Wait, what? You want to run it live?" She didn't look at him. Powell hesitated. "Leona, it's been unstable. If it surges again, we risk damaging the shaft permanently. Then run it at idle for 45 seconds, she said calmly. Then give me 30 seconds at full throttle. "You want full throttle," Powell repeated. "We're not even sure it can stabilize beyond half power. If it breaks, you'll know where to look. If it doesn't, then I will." No one spoke. A long pause. Then Powell gave a reluctant nod. "Start her up," he said to the technician. Systems clicked into life. Fans spun. Lights flickered back on. The turbine whined to life with a slow rising hum. It was quiet at first, almost cautious. The room filled with the low-frequency tremor of raw energy being released in controlled bursts. Leona crouched again, rod to metal, ear to rod. At exactly 45 seconds, she raised one hand. "Throttle." The technician glanced at Powell, who nodded once. "Throttle up." The sound doubled, tripled, thickened. The floor trembled. Loose bolts vibrated on the steel countertop. Everyone watched the digital readouts on the nearby terminal spike. Leona didn't flinch. She kept her ear to the rod, eyes closed, hand steady. Her face remained neutral, but her lips pressed together. After 30 seconds, she raised her hand again. Shut it down. The room fell back into silence. Fans slowed. Vibrations faded. Leona stood up, straightened her back, wiped a small trace of sweat from her forehead. Then she turned to Powell. It's not software, it's not pressure lag, and it's not sensor failure. She pointed to the rear of the turbine, just behind the second stage compressor. There's a harmonic misalignment. It only appears at peak RPM. The rotors are vibrating off-axis by a fraction of a millimeter. You don't hear it with diagnostics. You feel it. You listen for it. And you're only going to catch it once the machine's fully loaded. Silence. A stunned, stretched, breathless silence. Powell stared at her. You're sure she didn't answer? She didn't have to. The engineer who had scoffed earlier looked around at the others, searching for a lifeline that wasn't there. Leona bent down, picked up her rod, and slid it gently back into her toolbox. She closed the lid, latched it shut. Then, without another word, she walked toward the bay doors. No one tried to stop her, because in that moment, everyone knew the machine had spoken, and she was the only one who had heard it. The turbine spun down in a slow whine, its sound fading into stillness as the last vibrations rattled the overhead beams. The silence that followed wasn't like before. It was heavier, as if the entire bay had been holding its breath and suddenly realized it wasn't ready to exhale. Leona Harris stood up from her crouch beside the LM 2500 and set the brass rod gently into her toolbox. She didn't rush. Every movement was deliberate, grounded. She wiped her hands with a clean corner of a rag and faced the group gathered near the workstation. It's not the sensors, she said evenly. Her voice carried calm and certain, with no need for volume. It's not salt. It's not debris. The problem's not in the fuel mix or the combustion pressure. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. The rotor shaft is misaligned. Powell blinked, startled. Misaligned how? Leona nodded toward the rear assembly. High-frequency vibration, the kind that only shows up under peak load. It throws the rotor off-axis just enough to create harmonic distortion in the final 6 seconds of ramp-up. That's why it doesn't register in diagnostics. Your systems shut it down before it reaches threshold. The younger engineer, the same one who had scoffed earlier, shifted awkwardly, lips parted, but saying nothing. His eyes darted toward the others, looking for someone to speak first. No one did. Leona continued, her voice flat, clinical. You're checking for the wrong pattern. This isn't a mechanical failure. It's an undetected resonance response. Your calibrations weren't sensitive enough to register it. The engine isn't broken. It's out of rhythm. Another engineer stepped forward, hesitant. You're saying we missed a simple misalignment. It's not simple, she corrected. It's subtle. Subtle enough that you'd never find it staring at a monitor. You feel it. You hear it. She pointed once clearly, but calmly. Right there. That coupling's vibrating against the secondary bearing sleeve. Every time you cross 45 seconds of throttle, it throws off the entire system. The room stayed silent. No objections, no laughter, only realization. Powell ran a hand over his chin, then slowly nodded more to himself than anyone else. We didn't even think to test the clearances at full load, he said quietly. We were too focused on component failure. That's the problem, Leona replied. You were looking for a breakdown. This wasn't one. This was the machine trying to protect itself. You just didn't listen close enough. The younger engineer finally spoke, his voice lower than before. But we replaced everything, ran multiple simulations. How could none of it pick this up? Because you assumed the answer would come from the computer, she said, turning to face him fully. Not from experience, not from history. Not from someone who's heard this engine hum for most of her adult life. He didn't respond. Behind him, someone exhaled quiet, slow, the kind of breath that came when pride gave way to understanding. Leona looked at the group one last time, then reached down and latched her toolbox shut. I've done my part, she said. She didn't wait for permission. She turned and began walking toward the edge of the bay, each step echoing across the polished concrete. No one stopped her. No one tried to challenge her. Because in that moment, they knew. They hadn't just watched someone diagnose a machine. They had watched someone translate it, not through software or schematics, but through intuition, instinct, and time. Powell watched her go, his expression unreadable at first. Then he turned to his team and spoke quietly. Run a thermal scan at the bearing sleeve. Check axial and radial tolerances. Bring in the laser aligner. They moved quickly. No more hesitation. The engineer who had doubted her earlier remained where he was, eyes still fixed on the turbine. He looked down at his own hands, then toward the brass rod still sitting in Leona's open toolbox. He walked over slowly and crouched beside it, not touching, just studying. Someone behind him whispered, "She knew in under a minute." He nodded, not defensive this time. "Yeah." His voice dropped. "She really did." Back at the bay doors, Leona didn't look back. She didn't need to. The sound behind her had changed. It wasn't mocking anymore. It was quiet, heavy, respectful. No applause, no praise, just silence. The kind that follows when truth enters a room and nothing else is left to say. Because when the answer finally arrives, when the thing that no one could see is suddenly clear, it humbles everyone who thought they knew better. She didn't come back for revenge. She didn't explain more than she had to. And she certainly didn't stay to hear apologies that hadn't yet formed. She came to give the ship its rhythm back. And she did. The rest that was up to them. The sun was dipping low over Tracy Bay, casting long amber streaks across the water as Leona Harris stood behind her workshop, draining the last of the oil from an old outboard engine. The wind rustled through the cane grass nearby, and the soft clatter of a gull sounded in the distance. Her gloves were off fingers stained with grease, moving slowly and without urgency. For the first time in a long while, her body felt tired in a satisfying way. She had said what needed to be said. She had done what they couldn't, and she had left it at that. Inside the shop, the old rotary phone rang. It took her a second to hear it over the sound of the oil funnel and the quiet rhythm of nature around her. When it rang again, sharper this time, she wiped her hands on a towel, dropped the oil-stained rag into a bucket, and walked inside. The phone rang a third time as she reached it. She picked it up without rushing. Leona Harris. There was a short pause on the other end, followed by a familiar voice, lower, softer than she remembered it. "Miss Harris. It's Powell, Chief Engineer, USS Washington." Leona didn't say anything. His voice continued a little shaky, a little more deliberate now. "I just wanted to let you know. You were right." Still, she didn't speak. "We ran the tests again, like you said Powell said. We checked the axial and radial tolerances with the lasers hot. Your diagnosis was correct. The misalignment was there. Exactly like you described. The system sensors didn't pick it up at all. Not at idle, not at partial load. Only during that peak, harmonic window." He stopped for a breath, then added almost like he was afraid the next part might catch in his throat. "We trusted the data. Too much. We trusted machines to hear things only people like you can hear. You reminded us that the human ear, the human sense, still matters." There was another pause. Leona finally broke the silence, her voice low and even. "That engine never lied," she said. "You just didn't know how to listen." Powell didn't argue. He swallowed, and his next words came out more carefully. "The Admiral, he wants you to come back. Not to fix anything this time, just to speak. In person." Leona raised an eyebrow, leaning slightly against the workbench. "What for?" Powell exhaled. "To apologize." His voice softened further. "To say it directly. Face to face. Not in a message. Not in a memo. He told me to say this clearly. He was wrong. The system was wrong, and they're ready to say that out loud." Leona stared at the far wall, where her father's old socket set still hung untouched for years. Her eyes drifted to the shelf, where the worn Navy commendation certificate leaned behind a small tin of bolts. She didn't speak right away. Powell continued his tone, no longer rushed, no longer defensive. "I know it doesn't fix what happened. I know it doesn't erase the silence that followed you out the door 17 years ago, but it's a start, and I think you deserve to hear it from the people who stood by and let it happen." Leona ran her thumb slowly along the edge of the phone. She could hear the tension in his breathing. Not fear, just the unfamiliar weight of humility. She wondered how long he had been rehearsing those words before he dialed the number. "Miss Harris." She nodded once, even though he couldn't see it. "All right." Her voice was soft but steady. "I'll come." Powell seemed to breathe again on the other end. "Thank you," he said quietly. He didn't add anything else. There was no need. They both understood what wasn't being said. She hung up the phone gently. No triumphant smile followed. No victorious outburst. Just quiet. She turned and walked back toward the open bay doors. The air outside had cooled. Dusk was folding in, soft and slow. Her boots clicked against the floor, steady as always. Back at the workbench, she picked up her gloves and laid them beside the oil pan. Her eyes lingered on the brass rod sitting inside the toolbox, still streaked with the imprint of a machine that had nearly been abandoned by the very people who built it. She didn't reach for it this time. Instead, she walked out onto the dock, the planks groaning gently under her weight. The bay shimmered in the last light of day, calm, familiar. Leona folded her arms and stared out at the horizon, not because she needed to reflect, but because, for the first time in years, someone from the place that pushed her away had finally said 2 words she hadn't realized she still needed to hear: "You're right." And soon, she would hear something even more powerful: "We're sorry." It wouldn't erase the years. It wouldn't give her back the career they took. But it mattered, because healing doesn't always come with applause. Sometimes it just starts with one voice on the other end of the line, finally telling the truth. The thump of rotor blades echoed through the early morning fog like a slow heartbeat. Leona Harris stood at the edge of the dock behind her workshop, hands tucked into the pockets of her faded navy blue coveralls. The breeze tugged gently at the hem of her shirt. Her old toolbox sat by her feet, packed and closed. She had been standing there for almost 10 minutes before the helicopter came into view, descending in a wide arc over the cypress trees and settling gently onto the gravel clearing just beyond the workshop. The wind from the landing kicked up dust and dry leaves, swirling them around her boots. She didn't flinch. She had stood in worse. The side door opened and a young lieutenant stepped out. He was barely in his 30s, clean-shaven, stiff in posture, and clearly unsure how to approach her. He took 2 steps forward and removed his cap, holding it to his chest. "Miss Harris," he said, his voice clear over the whine of the slowing blades, "I've been sent by Admiral Matthews. He requests that you accompany me back to base." Leona gave a slight nod, bent down, and picked up her toolbox. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need more explanations. She simply said, "Let's go." The interior of the helicopter was loud and cold, but she sat comfortably in her seat, strapped in one hand, resting on the latches of her box. The lieutenant sat across from her eyes, occasionally darting toward her but quickly looking away when she met his gaze. She didn't blame him. Respect when it's real doesn't need words, and discomfort when it's honest doesn't need to be punished. The flight wasn't long, but it gave her time to settle. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't angry, but she was aware of what this meant, of what it didn't. She didn't expect a parade, but a truth being spoken aloud, even if late, was something she had learned to value. The helicopter touched down on a side pad adjacent to the main hangars. As the blades wound down, she saw the line of officers waiting near the landing zone. There were 6 of them, including Powell, standing straight with his hands behind his back. But it was the man in front, taller, broader hair, silver gray, and uniform pressed to perfection, that caught her eye. Admiral Ryan Matthews. He stepped forward as she descended the metal steps of the chopper, his face serious but not stiff. He removed his cap and met her eyes directly. "Leona Harris," he said, "welcome back." She didn't shake his hand yet. She let him speak. He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle before continuing. "I won't pretend this fixes the past. I won't offer excuses. I just want to tell you the truth. I was part of a system that turned its back on you. I didn't speak up when I should have, and I've carried that with me." Leona stood still, expression unreadable. Ryan continued slower now. "We let you take the fall for a problem you didn't cause, and we pushed you away without giving you the dignity of being heard." He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a white envelope, plain, unmarked except for a seal. "This is your formal reinstatement of service honor. It comes with a notation of distinguished contribution and an official letter of apology from the Pacific Naval Command. There's a small compensation included, but I know that's not why you're here." He extended the envelope. Leona took it without a word. Her fingers brushed his for half a second before she placed it in the inner pocket of her coveralls. She didn't open it. Behind Ryan, the line of engineers and officers watched in silence. Some looked down at the ground. Others held her gaze when she turned to them. No more smirks, no more whispers. Just quiet. Real quiet. The kind that meant something had shifted. Powell stepped forward, next, his voice soft but steady. "I read your file. After Guam. I never saw it before. Didn't know the full story until last night. If I had known sooner, maybe I would have spoken differently the first time we met." Leona didn't answer. He continued, "All I can say is, I'm sorry, and thank you." She nodded once, then glanced over the shoulder of the group toward the maintenance bay. The big doors were open now, and from where she stood, she could see the LM-2500 through the gap, partially reassembled active monitors blinking, the same engine that tried to speak to them for days and was ignored, until she showed up. She turned back to Ryan. "I'm not here to be celebrated," she said plainly. "I didn't come for applause." "I know," he replied. "You came for the ship, and for your name." She looked him in the eye. "Names matter," she said, "even when people try to forget them." His face tightened slightly, but he nodded. "You're right." He stepped back, gave her a clear path toward the hangar, but she didn't walk that way. Not yet. She turned to the team, looked them over one last time. Not to scold, not to preach, just to see. And what she saw was enough. Respect in their faces, no shame required, just recognition. She took a step back toward the helicopter. Ryan moved forward, confused. "You're not staying." She shook her head. "My work's done." He hesitated. "Anything you want us to pass along to command?" Leona offered the faintest trace of a smile, one corner of her mouth lifting for just a second. "Yeah," she said. "Tell them next time they hear a machine making a sound they don't recognize, they should listen." Then she climbed the steps back into the helicopter toolbox in hand and took her seat by the window. As the blades began to spin again, lifting her off the concrete, she looked down one last time at the officers below. They weren't waving, they weren't saluting, but they were standing still, and they were watching. Not because they had to, because they wanted to. That was enough. She looked away and rested her back against the seat. For the first time in a long time, she felt something settle in her chest. Not triumph, not vindication, but peace. Because sometimes justice doesn't roar. Sometimes it just walks back through the gate and is finally allowed to leave on her own terms. The helicopter rose gently from the tarmac, its rotors slicing the morning air with a steady rhythm. Inside, Leona Harris sat in silence, her seatbelt snug across her chest, her old metal toolbox secured beside her boots. She leaned slightly toward the window, one hand resting on her knee, the other tucked under her chin. The sky over the coast was still dressed in pale gray, the sun barely beginning to break through the haze. Below, the sprawl of the naval base slowly receded into the distance, hangars, cranes, warehouses, antenna towers, all growing smaller, quieter. Then she saw it. The USS Washington, docked just minutes ago, now pulling away from the pier, its sleek gray hull cutting through the harbor waters with confident ease. Crew members stood in formation along the deck rails, their uniforms crisp against the morning breeze. The destroyer's massive frame glided forward, carried by the same engine that had once failed, now roaring back to life with smooth, unwavering power. Leona didn't blink. She simply watched. No words, no reaction, just presence. Her eyes followed the ship as it moved toward open water, its wake leaving soft white lines in its path. The sound of the turbine, even from this height, was unmistakable, low, even alive, the kind of sound only a perfectly tuned machine could make. The kind of sound she knew by heart. It had been 17 years since she last heard that engine sing. And now it was singing again. Below her, the destroyer grew smaller with each second, but the feeling in her chest remained full. Not pride exactly, not triumph. Something quieter, something steadier. Peace. She remembered the first time she walked the maintenance corridors of a ship like that. Young, determined, unwelcome. She remembered the sideways looks, the clipped tones, the disbelief every time she explained a fix that others had missed. And still she stayed. She listened. She worked. Because the machines never doubted her. They never cared who she was. They only responded to whether she knew what she was doing. And she did. The pilot glanced over his shoulder, his voice coming through the headset. "Everything all right back there, ma'am?" Leona nodded once her gaze still locked on the ocean below. "I'm good." He nodded and turned back to his controls. She didn't speak again. There was nothing left to say. From the corner of her eye, she caught the final glimpse of the Washington's hull as it passed the breakwater and entered open sea. The ship dipped slightly, as if bowing to the horizon before disappearing into the morning light. It had carried her failure once. Now it carried her name invisible, but etched deep in the rhythm of its heartbeat. Back in the cabin, Leona reached down and opened the latch on her toolbox. Inside, everything was exactly where it had always been. The brass rod sat neatly in its place, the same rod they had laughed at. The same rod that had revealed the answer no machine could find. She picked it up and held it across her lap. Not like a trophy, like a memory. Every groove on its surface told a part of the story. She traced them gently with her thumb, her mind quiet. They wouldn't put her name on a plaque. No medals would be mailed to her home. And that was fine. Some victories don't live in glass cases. Some just live in knowing that when no one else could figure it out, you did. When others gave up, you listened. When a machine stopped breathing, you brought it back to life. The helicopter began its descent. The fields and trees of southern Louisiana came into view, the winding line of the bayou carving through the landscape like a scar with purpose. Leona took one last glance at the horizon. The USS Washington was gone now, out of sight, but not out of reach. Its engine would carry it forward miles at sea, across waters calm and violent, guided by commands fueled by power, and somewhere deep in its core would echo the precise alignment only one person had been able to hear. Not because she was lucky, but because she had lived it, had earned it, had bled for it. The landing was smooth. The helicopter settled into the clearing behind her workshop, the same place it had picked her up the day before. The same trees stood in their places. The same smell of salt soil and engine oil drifted on the breeze. The door opened. Leona stepped down, toolbox in hand, back straight. The pilot gave a small nod. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. She walked toward the shop at her own pace. No cameras, no speeches, just the sound of wind through the grass and the soft crunch of gravel beneath her boots. Inside the workshop was exactly as she had left it. Tools hung in neat rows. A disassembled boat motor sat waiting on the bench. The small radio crackled quietly halfway between stations. She placed the toolbox on the bench, removed the brass rod, and set it next to the carburetor she'd been working on 2 days ago. Then she took off her coveralls, hung them by the door, and sat down on the old wooden stool in the corner. She exhaled slowly. There were no tears, no shaking hands, just stillness. The kind that comes when a chapter closes not loudly, but completely. From her stool, she looked at the wall opposite her. That same Navy commendation still leaned slightly to the left. Dust had gathered in the corners of the frame. She didn't move to clean it. She just looked at it. Not with anger, not even sadness, just understanding. Because she knew now that her story wouldn't be rewritten by those who had tried to bury it. It would be remembered in the way the Washington moved through water, in the engineers who stayed quiet when they should have spoken and now understood why silence matters, in every vibration that might one day confuse another crew, until someone remembered what Leona Harris had once taught them, that sometimes the truth isn't found in a screen or a printout. Sometimes it comes from listening, from paying attention, from never forgetting the people who got you there in the first place. Outside, the wind picked up just slightly. And somewhere far out at sea, the USS Washington continued its mission, flawless, powerful, alive. It didn't speak, but it didn't need to, because long after the names fade and the stories quiet down, a ship always remembers who brought it back to life, and so does the sea. The story of Leona Harris is not just about an engine or a ship or even redemption. It's about dignity, about quiet strength, about the courage to return to a place that once pushed you away, not for revenge, but for truth. Her journey reminded us that not every victory is loud, and not every recognition needs a spotlight. Sometimes healing comes from a single moment of being seen. Sometimes what lasts the longest is not the applause, but the respect that settles in silence. And now, we'd love to hear from you. Have you ever been overlooked, underestimated, or silenced, even when you knew you were right? What did you do in that moment? If Leona's story touched something in you, if it reminded you of someone you know or of a part of yourself, please share it in the comments below. And if you believe stories like this matter, if you believe quiet courage deserves to be heard, we invite you to like this video, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe to the channel. Together, let's keep telling stories that heal, that honor, and that remind us of the strength we carry inside, no matter who's watching. Thank you for being here with us.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.